In this segment, I want to talk more about what is polygamous culture and the polygamous way of life really like. And so Mike, let's talk about that a little bit. I know that these different polygamous groups probably have a lot of things in common, but also a lot of things that are distinct because they each have their own decades of history and so forth. So what are some of the things that polygamists in Utah today tend to have in common in terms of the whole overall polygamous culture, lifestyle, worldview, any of the big picture for us?
It's a broad topic. Today's polygamists, depending on what group they're from, but I would say all of them in common are very strong on believing in Joseph Smith.
Okay.
And that's a general statement that I've not run into anyone that has recently come out of polygamy that does not believe that. So they're very strong on Joseph Smith. Also, when a person leaves any polygamy group, any person that I've ever met that have left any polygamy group, they make two decisions right off the bat. One is, I'm going to leave, and most of the time I will leave my family behind.
Okay.
Family meaning, brothers, sisters, mother, father, that sort of thing. The second decision, I'm going to hell.
Because in their theology, it's so connected, their relationship with God is so connected with their identity in the polygamous unit, right?
Yes. And they are taught from very small children that if you ever leave the organization, you will go to hell.
Well, that's pretty powerful, very potent, and I think later on we'll have a chance to talk about then how do we communicate with a person, how do we encourage a person who's coming under that burden. That's a huge burden on the soul to be able to feel that. So what are some of the way of life? It sounds like they're very controlling.
Extremely.
If they're threatening people with the loss of their salvation. So what are some of the ways that sort of controlling culture takes shape in these different groups?
Let me talk about the FLDS. The FLDS is obey the prophet first. Trust, they're taught from childhood, trust no one, absolutely no one. Don't trust your father, your mother, totally. Don't trust your wife, anyone else except the prophet. And what the prophet says goes. And if the prophet condemns you to hell, that's where you will go. And so the prophet's orders are given. It is overseen by an angry God.
Yeah.
And and to them, God is this big God who they have to make sure they keep him happy all the time. And they do it by obeying the prophet or obeying the fatherhead of the home, obeying the father. And so the women, the wives, there simply is no such thing in most families as a wife opposing her husband, or children opposing the parents.
Okay. It's very authoritarian, top-down, male-centered authoritarian.
Yes.
Now, it seems to me like, at least in the FLDS case, that the prophet has given a lot of edicts and directives that seem really irrational.
And they have to obey him. And in the FLDS, it covered every area of life. And so, for instance, the cleaning of their homes. The cleaning of their homes, they had to start at the center of the ceiling and work their way around. Then they had to clean the walls going down. And there's a certain way of putting on their clothing. It's just, certain things that they can eat and cannot eat, and that changes from time to time. And so it's an extremely controlling lifestyle.
So then, so life if you're a child or if you're one of the wives, what might everyday life look like in one of these groups?
I would say, again, in the FLDS, the way it looks is you're up very early in the morning, and in the houses they had to have recordings of Warren Jeffs playing at all times, and then every day was a day of what they called their worship, and so they would gather in a certain room, and they would then listen to Warren Jeffs recordings. and they would be taught from the Book of Mormon, and they would be taught the history of the polygamist group that they belong to. Now that's lighter in the Allred group.
Okay.
And the Kingston group, it's somewhat similar, but if you go FLDS, the children are taught that when the prophet speaks and tells the father who the daughter will marry, she will marry that person.
Okay, wow.
And in the Allred group, they do have a sort of a courting style there, and so they can choose their own wives within limits.
Right.
And the Kingstons, it's my understanding that they're very much appointed as well.
Right, okay.
And then there's many independent groups,
Okay.
and they're wild, off the board type stuff.
It does seem like the history of these polygamous movements is fraught with all kinds of schisms and splinters, and do they all respect each other, or do they all think that we're the only one?
From what I've found out within the organization, it's very interesting that we're the only one. And the Allreds have their prophet,
Right.
the Kingstons have their leaders, and the FLDS has their prophet. However, it's very interesting. A few years ago, I spent a week in Colorado City after the flash flood came through, and there were a number of deaths of small children and moms and that sort of thing. And so at the funerals, all the main polygamist groups were present there. And so they all come in and they help each other. And again, they have that similar bond of all of them still worship Joseph Smith.
How do these groups survive economically? Since they seem kind of cloistered, right, from society, how do they survive economically?
I'll start with the FLDS. There, the father has often had a business, and then the wives, a lot of them had to have their own income. But in the FLDS, generally speaking, unless you were a member of the royal family, of the Jeffs family, then the children were sent off onto work groups, and so the children always had to bring in they had to bring in as much money as possible. Allreds, they have their own businesses, not as controlling.
Yeah.
However, the Kingstons, they just in Salt Lake County alone, the papers have reported they own 110 major businesses.
Wow.
Just within Salt Lake County. And very interesting there, talk about economics, their people are not allowed to have American dollars. They have their own banking system, they have their own money system, and so the money that's earned by any individual or by any business all goes into the Kingston banks, and then they are issued money back as they need it on a budget that was preset. So the Kingstons take all the money.
Wow.
Yeah.
Just one more thing on this topic in this segment is, then I want to play out a little bit more. We've touched on it, but let's talk a little bit more about what is the relationship that these groups have with the larger society.
Okay. Again, let me start. FLDS, very little relationship with the outdoors, with the rest of society.
Right.
They only can they talk with people on the outside if it's business related and if it's related to bringing money in. Otherwise, they're not taught. Otherwise they're taught not to deal with the outside. To the extreme, a couple of years ago, got very close to a father and one of his wives with 7 children, and they left. They had to escape. And it took 3 days for those 7 children, for most of those kids, to ever look up and look out the window of that van. The father told me, he says, because they have been taught that if they ever make eye contact with someone from the outside, they could lose their salvation.
Okay, wow.
Yeah, and again, the Allreds, they can pretty much communicate with others. There are not as great restrictions there. And then when you go over to the Kingstons, mostly business. If it means making money, then they're very open to communicating. And the All Reds are maybe the most friendly of any of the polygamists.
Right, okay.
And a number of the independents as well.
Do they send their kids to public schools? Do they homeschool? Or?
The FLDS, we've run into many, many children that have never seen the inside of a classroom. Again, the members of the royal family, they are taught through homeschooling process and through the church process. No public education for most of them. And it depended on what the mood was of Warren Jeffs.
Right.
The All Reds send their children to the public school, but they also have a private school of their own, and so some people make use of that. And the Kingstons, on the other hand, it's my understanding about 30 years ago, they made a major decision to encourage education and to go as high in the educational system you can in the public school system and go on to college. So the Kingstons, if you're in Salt Lake City, and if you're just doing business with, you never know, an attorney might be a Kingston, doctors, they have doctors, lawyers, they really promote education. Yeah.
Well, that's a great overview, I think, of a little bit of LDS culture and what life is like. And in the next segment, we're going to burrow down a little bit and talk more about how that affects individual attitudes and individual interactions.